Okay, so today I want to introduce you to some philosophy of mathematics. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh no, philosophy of mathematics, that sounds really hard. I don't know how to do mathematics. That's okay. I don't know how to do mathematics either. Um, what I want to do, in fact, my goal today in our little 30-minute or so long soiree here is just, I really only have about 6 slides here. I just want to locate the philosophy of mathematics in the larger sort of philosophical scene that we have a grasp of now. Um, so, for example, in both the epistemology and psychology classes, we're talking a lot about empiricism and rationalism. Really, in philosophy of mathematics, I'm going to point out to you the basic three traditions, which would be Platonism, which is a kind of realism about mathematical objects, and then show you the two early modern derivatives, the one that comes intuitionism, which comes out of rationalism and Kant, and then formalism, which is an empiricist approach to the issue of mathematics. So we're going to look at some stuff. Let's get started on that with our little philosophy of mathematics. Sounds cool, doesn't it? But we want to, as I say, our goals here are humble. I say empiricist's greatest challenge, so let me talk about that here on this little title slide. Um, yeah, empiricism's greatest challenge. So, what does empiricism say? Empiricism says that knowledge is produced by experience, and that we know things by virtue of experiencing them, and in particular by becoming accustomed to them. So, finding things out, we find things out that we can experience. Mathematics is one of the really big problems for empiricism. And if you've been in my class, you know that I have pretty strong empiricist sympathies. I'm going to be sympathetic, for example, to some Humean and Wittgensteinian lines about mathematics today in this discussion. But I have to say, I mean, I am also someone who's very much into the ancient Greek philosophy. And the place where I get those Platonic intuitions is on the issue of mathematics. I think really the issue is um, about whether or not the world is a kind of organized place, and whether the fact that the world is an organized place would constitute something that would take away from a kind of materialist monism. Or in other words, are we still naturalists, monists, materialists, if we say that that in addition to there being the world that exists, it also appears to be a kind of formally organized place? Because I think that's really sort of the claim. I think the claim is manifestly true, by the way. So anyway, for me, as someone who tries to put together maybe a coherent empiricist sort of take on philosophy, then the long and the short of it is, it does look as if I'm really not satisfied with any of these stories that empiricists like the two, notably John Stuart Mill and Wittgenstein. And Hume, of course, is really the one that you also often really want to know about for empiricism. But I'm really not satisfied with what any of them, including Wittgenstein, have to say about mathematics at all, really. It does look to me like mathematics is capturing some description of some kind of transcendental thing. I mean, in other words, again, I just have Platonic intuitions about it. So let's take a look at a couple of theories. What is our goal here? Our goal here is to situate the philosophy of mathematics in this larger framework of philosophy, notably Platonic realism versus Hume versus Kant, that we're familiar with now as sort of an underlying framework for a lot of the philosophical conversations that we looked at, especially in philosophy of mind and also in epistemology. So Platonic realism is being realist about math. I mean, we're talking about the metaphysics of mathematics. Remember what metaphysics is. Let's start with the basics. Metaphysics is the study of being, categories of being, what kinds of things exist. So in our philosophy of psychology class, of course, our philosophy of mind class, whichever, we're always talking about mind-body dualism, arguments for mind-body dualism, reasons for thinking that our concept of mind involves us in non-physical reference. So, that's an example of metaphysics. Plato has a particular kind of metaphysical view. He thinks, as I mentioned before, in addition to the material world, that he thinks is a world of constantly coming to be and passing away, a world of contingency and imperfection, there's also a formal level of being, which is a world of necessity and perfection. It also is not a world of multiplicity, it's a unity, it's a oneness, which I think people too often forget in thinking about Platonic realism. But in any event, Plato's view is that mathematics, the form he calls it, I think that I do believe and have thought for a very long time that the right way to get at Plato's metaphysics is to think about it as the metaphysics of mathematics, and as that pertains to our sort of general cosmology. I think that's what Plato's on about. And so mind and matter independent, that is, think of an empty void, or even what you can't think of, which would be nothing material at all, spatial or temporal or otherwise. But in any event, just think of an empty universe, okay, a big old empty space, whatever that means. Plato thinks, look, all the formal elements of mathematics, the unity of mathematics would still be valid. It would still, he thinks, exist. That is, again, mind independent, matter independent. It would not matter if there were any rational beings. This is the difference between Plato and Kant. People often miss Plato because they think that Plato must be saying the same thing that Kant is saying. Kant is saying that we're sort of projecting these kinds of mathematical structures out of our mind. Plato is saying these are parts of the world. They're transcendental, non-physical entities that exist. What are these? We can say numbers. Roughly today, most of the time, we can think of numbers if you want to be specific about what we're talking about. So Plato's a dualist. Plato's a form-matter dualist. So Plato thinks that matter exists, and then he thinks there's something else that exists, again, independently of matter, which is form. Plato is a mind-body dualist, but only in as much as he thinks that mind is an example of formal organization. The real dualism for Plato is the dualism between form and matter. And then understanding Aristotle's metaphysics then is seeing how Aristotle thinks that this is a metaphysically promiscuous view and is always trying to see if he can have that middle way of merging the form and the matter together. We're talking about Plato right now. So basically for the moderns, for modern philosophers, a big part of the project for a lot of them has been to sort of give an account of numbers in mathematics that isn't committed to some kind of ontological realism about mathematics like Plato had for most of the time. Bertrand Russell seems to be comfortable sometimes saying that he's a Platonist and sometimes saying that he's not. He's one of these people who run through a lot of different positions. And Bertrand Russell is one of the big philosophers that we're going to be talking about here. He comes up. So first, formalism. Now, again, all of these isms are controversial, but what we want to do is look at them in terms of context. Formalism is, another ism, instrumentalist. What does instrumentalist mean? It means that the justification is pragmatic, means, so that what makes it something true, remember William James, what makes something true is sort of that it has high utility value somehow. And also, I think something that's often overlooked in James and pragmatism is that also definitely commits us to generating through trial and error, using the law of effect to generate organization. So that's an idea. That is, here's a way of looking at it. Mathematical language, then, you could think of it in the classical way that mathematical language was referring to numbers and equations, and these things are real mathematical objects that exist in the world. That's the Platonic way of looking at things. And the formalist, who's a kind of pragmatist, right? Remember, the pragmatist got away from that correspondence theory of truth and said, well, no, we have an instrumentalist or a utilitarian theory of truth, right? It's the utility value of holding the proposition, not its probability of corresponding to reality. So formalism tries to do that to mathematics, right? It's, well, what you've got here is formalism, that is, there's a formal way of moving these symbols around. It's a prosthetic, it's a technology, and what we do with it, the reason we developed it and what it is an instrument, So this is the instrumentalist theory, kind of evolved human behavior. This is Wittgenstein's view. Again, the way Wittgenstein puts it, I'm not sure somehow, but the idea is that you have a human behavior because humans have certain kinds of bodies and live certain kinds of lives. And so humans have this evolved behavior, which is sort of mathematical verbal behavior, is what he wants to say. But this is the thing about pragmatism in general, because that also is a kind of pragmatist. Remember, Wittgenstein also has a pragmatist view of language. He has a functional role semantics. He says that the thing that makes the proposition true is that meaning is use. The thing that you're doing with the proposition, the thing that you're doing with the linguistic object is what you're calling the meaning. Right. So, but there's a basic criticism that we can make of pragmatism. I think it's important to understand these instrumentalist, pragmatist, and in general operationalist approaches, because they have a lot to commend them. In particular, that they give us a way of talking about things usually without the formation of mental representations like Descartes. So that's an important thing. But we can always ask that last bullet point on the slide there, why do the propositions have the utility value that they do? Right, there's another perfectly reasonable question. So it looks as if it's an incomplete theory of truth to say that the thing that makes it true is that it works for us. Because it's a perfectly coherent question for me to then ask, but why does that work for us? I think. So in that sense, instrumentalism kind of begs the question, why is it instrumentally utile to adopt this proposition rather than that one? And I mean, a pretty good common sense answer to that would probably be because the world is like that, you know. So, all right, so we saw formalism, basically an empiricist take, looks to me is going to sort of have to be a pragmatist kind of take, an instrumentalist kind of take. I think Wittgenstein's right about that. I'm just not sure it really does the job because, again, it looks like it still adverts ultimately to something about the way that the world is and not just the way that we're looking at the world. Well, we saw Kant's general program. I mean, what's Kant in general doing? Remember, Kant doesn't like it that modern science, empirical science, like David Hume's vision, is kind of amoral, godless, doesn't have an account of values, doesn't have an account of freedom of will. So Kant's strategy is to say that that phenomenal world, the world that we experience, the world that science studies, is just that, a world of experience, a kind of representation, that our rationality actually has a conceptual order that it imposes on the world. People forget how far out Kant is about that. Remember, Kant says that space and time are parts of this intuition, right? When Kant says intuition, Kant means I am using my intuition rather than allow the empiricist, my senses, to determine things about the world, notably, for example, that it's a world with space and time, with cause and effect relations between multiple objects, even the multiplicity of objects, of course, because the noumenal world, the world itself, is that sort of Parmenidean one world, very strange. So this Kantian idea that so many people nowadays take for granted, even though it is kind of a weird thing to think, if you ask me, is that mathematics is a projection that the mind projects onto the world. that all of the conceptual structure is mental. This is transcendental idealism, right? Idealism, remember Berkeley, that what the world really is something mental. What does that mean? That, for example, time and space and causation and the multiplicity of objects are mental. So so this is what Kant does just in general. Now he said, how's Kant going to approach mathematics? Well, that's clear enough. Mathematics is just going to be an integral part, sort of the integral structure of this conceptual scheme. But that is a projection of the mind onto the world. Kant's question begging to my mind today, in the same way that pragmatism is, because, well, he says this is the projection that we make onto the world. But where does the mind come from? According to Descartes, it's sort of God. God puts these clear and distinct ideas. And Kant also thinks that when we're thinking rationally and not in this phenomenal way, that necessarily God exists. The argument's lame, folks, but that's what he wants to do with it. Now, a problem for empiricism, third bullet point on the slide, is that, remember, empiricism says that everything we know by experience. All our knowledge is produced by experience with the senses. But think about any mathematical proposition or proof or discussion that has to do with infinite sets. For example, say the proof of the infinity of primes, that there are an infinite number of prime numbers, say. Now that is a valid proof, but it certainly looks as if that knowledge goes beyond any kind of sensory experience that anyone has. It's not difficult to show that, is it? So the problem is, it looks as if proofs, notably, and usually the example in the literature people will use is infinite sets, although there are other examples that go beyond any possible human experience, any possible quotidian sensory experience. And so it looks like empiricism has a big problem with that. Kantian Intuitionism can respond to that. It's a funky response, but here's one line about that, and that is this: that all right, the Kantian is intuiting sort of these mathematical logical principles while thinking about the world, because thinking about the world to the Kantian, right, just is projecting these kinds of principles onto the world and trying to make the world coherent according to this conceptual structure of the mind. That's Kant. So then what about those infinite sets? Well, the idea is, well, you sort of refer to the infinite sets, but since Kantian Intuitionism is sort of the mind intuiting, that is applying the conceptual structure to the world, it never actually crosses the conceptual infinite. You think of infinite sets, but you don't actually experience an infinite set as infinite. In that sense, you refer to infinite sets, but you don't actually see an infinite set, say, in your mind's eye, as it were. That's not something that can be done. So then, if the mind is projecting, and this is transcendental idealism, where the thing is, and its ontological basis is something mental, Kant says, well, but there aren't infinite sets like that. I mean, they're sort of referred to in this rational mental level. I think that's what he wants to say. And notice that gets around that problem that the empiricist had, because Kant says, yeah, sure, no, you don't experience infinity. You refer to it. You can think about its logical properties, not because of experience, but because you're a rational being. So then logicism. Logicism is a tricky one. The idea is that logic and mathematics are identical. That's a thing. That's a cottage industry. People arguing on one side or the other that they are or are not identical. I'm not going to pretend to have mastered that discussion. one way of looking at that is, can you translate them both into natural language? Again, these are all controversial and not everybody agrees on that. But one easy take, one low fruit here in terms of what we're doing, because we're worried about that Platonic realism. We don't want those non-physical Platonic entities rattling around in our cosmos. So we want to fix that. And we saw Kant's approach to that. We saw an empiricist approach to that. Neither one entirely satisfactory. Another one, and this is one that Bertrand Russell was always fooling around with, was logicism. The thesis that logic and mathematics are identical because then logic is supposedly ontologically neutral. Logic is more like a game. Logic is not corresponding to anything. So to get the sense of this is, people complain, well, why do math and logic, why does logic have all these X's and Y's and little symbols for things? Why not just put it in plain English? Why not just use examples? And the reason is, and this is the same with formalizing mathematics, using numbers and symbols, is because what you want to look at is the structure of the argument. That is your topic. That is the thing that you're examining. So you want to bring that up into relief. The difference between soundness, whether the logic of these propositions, fall together in an appropriate rule-governed way, versus truth, whether the sentences that you're saying are true. All battleships are kumquats. All kumquats are refrigerators. So all battleships are refrigerators. Right? That's sound, but it's valid. I'm sorry, it's not. the proof is not sound, but the argument is valid. But the proof is not sound because the sentences are false. Soundness is true sentences and valid logical structure. And when you got those two things together, then you say that the argument is sound. So again, that's the sort of intuition Bertrand Russell has as a logician. He's thinking, okay, well, logic isn't making any ontological commitments at all. Logic is just strictly this kind of formal exercise. I'm not sure that that's true. My diagnosis then, starting there at point 3 on the bullet points, is that it's Cartesianism again. And Bertrand Russell was way Cartesian, by the way. They had this really bad movement in the early English analytical stuff in the early 20th century called phenomenalism. Phenomenalism, the idea that, well, there are phenomena, sense data, and that's what I really experience. And of course, I say that because I'm a good empiricist, but that's bad empiricism. That's not paying attention to Hume at all, right? Hume says, no, what you've got is experience. The only thing you can possibly refer to as reality is these objects of your experience. So when these English people like Russell in the early 20th century are saying they're phenomenalists, it's lame. They're just not understanding empiricism well. So where does, and I do want to talk now about where, I'm going to give it a whack. Why not? Where numbers do come from in a sec. But both logic and math have to have worlds. You have to have at least a world with an X and a Y in it. You have to at least have the integer. What is the integer? The thing, the one, which in its wholeness as a one then also suggests division. And that starts to get pretty cosmic, but that does seem to have to do with just being itself. I would say, in an anti-Cartesian mood, I would appeal to sort of the Darwinian reasoning of the last bullet point on the slide here, that look, my ancestors, so say they were an alien being from outer space, all they had was, they abducted me and they just had me to study. They would see that I have this opposable thumb here, Okay, there's my hand. It was really, really finely organized thing with this opposable thumb. What would they read off of that? They hadn't seen my world, and they hadn't seen any other beings like me. All they had was just me, my body. But they could look at that physical trait of my body, the opposable thumb, the hand in general, and they could infer well enough that I had evolved in an ancestral environment full of medium range size physical objects that I can and need to manipulate a lot. Read that off the trait. The trait is evidence of features of the ancestral environment. Now I have a brain that thinks logically. I have an opposable thumb that grasps medium range size physical objects, and I have a brain that thinks logically, that grasps deductive and inductive inferences when it can. How come? Because the world is like that. My brain reflects the world just as much as my opposable thumbs or my light receiving eyes. That you can read the world right off of them. Again, this is what Plato gets right and Kant gets wrong. Formal structure is in the world. Okay, so that's the last bullet point on that slide. Now, so realism without Platonism. Okay, is there, because it looks to me, I think you can get the dualism down to this, that maybe there are two sort of cosmic questions. The first one is, why is there something rather than nothing? So maybe that's a cosmic question. What do I mean by cosmic question? Just a question that can't be answered. Maybe there's no answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? But then maybe there's a second proposition or second question, which is this question: why is the something that exists organized the way that it is? And maybe that too is just a brute fact that doesn't have an answer. And so again, to try and minimize the claim of the dualism, make it as little of an real ontological dualism as possible, I would say the question is, am I a materialist if, in addition to the fact that something exists rather than nothing, do I also concede that it appears to have some sort of organization? Now, I mean, notice this isn't really necessarily the argument between, say, astrophysicists as to whether or not the world came into existence out of the Big Bang with symmetrical organization, or whether it had some sort of chaotic initial state and structure evolved out of chaos. That's an argument, and maybe someday someone much smarter than me will tell us what the answer to that is in a persuasive way. I'm not sure it matters to the point that I'm making here, though. I'm just flagging that. So what about these numbers? Can we talk about where numbers come from in a way that respects the fact that the universe seems to be an organized place? And I think it is. Again, whether or not that happened before or after the Big Bang is not necessarily my concern here. The question is the world an organized place? I would say the answer is clearly kind of overwhelmingly yes. So how does this work? I think here's roughly, Plato says, look, the world is made out of sets. Plato's interested in the metaphysics of properties. And Plato's universals are properties. Sometimes people say certain kinds of properties, like geometrical properties. But sometimes people say all kinds of properties, like color properties and all kinds of contingent properties. Property being a member of a species. Plato and Aristotle think species are fixed natural kinds. So for Plato, every time there's a property, he thinks that every time there's a category, he thinks there's a property is a category, just two different kinds of words. And he's a realist about the properties. He thinks that there's always a property that sort of is the thing that's organizing the matter into that form. So you got a indefinitely large number of these forms, Platonic forms. At a minimum, you've got the form of the triangle, the form of the circle, and so on. But then you've got the form of the horse and the form of the human. But then you've got the form of blue, and and these are discussed in Plato in his later dialogues. Well, but in any event, enough to say that the world is organized into sets, whether or not properties are primary being rather than individuals. That's a bundle theory of individuals, right? That an individual, a concrete individual thing, like a person, is in fact composed out of properties. And it's the properties that are the things that don't come to be and pass away. The property of blue doesn't come to be and pass away. So the world is organized into sets because there are properties. The properties are properties of multiple things. That's what defines a set. A set is all the things that share a property. And since the world is built that way, there are all these finite sets around. And the number words are the names of these sets, of the sizes of these sets. And so far, I'm all in with Plato on that being the origin of numbers. But last bullet point, Plato, I agree with Aristotle that Plato is kind of ontologically promiscuous. There's really, or maybe not Plato, maybe an interpretation of Plato. Because my reading is that there's really only one form. Remember, mathematics is a unity. It's not a plurality. It's indivisible. It can't be cut in half. It doesn't have parts. From any one part of mathematics, from the concept of any number, from that concept, it is implicit. All of the other numbers and all of the functions. All of mathematics unfolds from any part of it. It can't be chopped up. It can't be divided. And since your soul is, the part of you that participates in mathematics, it shares in those properties of being indivisible, eternal, perfect, unchanging. But see, when it changes when you get clear that there can only be one form. Form just is the reality of the organization of the universe. The triangle and the circle are just two manifestations of the same thing. There's only one form. And so that does sort of change things. So I can be a realist in the sense of say, yes, in addition to the world existing, the world is also a formally organized place. And so we have sets. So we have beings like us, and we have sets, and we have numbers. And if that makes me a dualist, well, as Huck Finn said, then by God, I'll go to hell. Okay, so again, I'm going to give you some links to just the classic stuff. What is the classic stuff? Well, you've got sort of originally Platonism about numbers. Then you get this early modern discussion between Kant and Hume Mill, the discussion between the rationalists and the empiricists, and then you get the formalism, intuitionism, and logicism that I went over. And there's a contemporary literature. It does go into great mathematical depth, and many of the people who practice this are very adept at higher mathematics. I am not one of those people, but the project today was to show you how it sort of fits along this kind of divide between the rationalists and the empiricists, and in this case, the ancient Greeks, just like ethics, interestingly. All right. Okay, so on that happy note, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.